Hello, folks. Welcome to Inside the Marble Palace, Postmedia's legislative report. I'm Murray Mandryk. And hey, I am inside the Marble Palace for a change, and I'm there because it's budget day. So is Arthur White-Crummey, who is joining me on budget day to talk about what we have just seen from the finance minister. And in Saskatoon, Phil Tank from the Star of Phoenix, who, like most of us these days, has to do his job today from a distance. Hi, guys.
Hey, Murray.
I got Arthur.
Good to be right next door to you again.
Yes, look at that. Look at that. We're actually, they got the band back together. I'm going to start with you, Arthur, because you were kind of closest to what the minister said today. Can you offer a selection of highlights, numbers that really struck you as being interesting compared with past budgets that you've seen? And obviously, there's going to be a fair number of it today. I guess we'll start out with big spending, less revenue, and big debt and deficits.
Yeah, so we're seeing a record-setting $2.6 billion deficit. We set a record in last year's budget, and we're doing so again. So the roll continues, but this time it's largely because of increased spending, increased items on the expense side of the ledger, and not based on lower revenue, as we largely saw last time around. So we're seeing
that is still a problem, right? That we still, just to be
clear, we're
clear,
seeing pretty flat revenue this year. I mean, the change is not as significant as what we're seeing on the expense side, but the expense side, we're seeing some really big pressures. So health is up quite a bit, more than 5% record spending there. We're also seeing a really big pension adjustment, which is purely an accounting issue, but does obligate the government. So they have to book that. It's costing them more than $400 million. All told, it's about $1 million more in expense. A lot of it to pay for some of their promises during the election, which they've spent a lot of time informing us that they've kept. They kept 14 promises, Murray, but they didn't keep one of the biggest ones, which was to reach that 4-year back to balance. Instead, it's going to be until 2026, 27, 5 years down the road where we finally get back into the black ink. And as you pointed out, the Saskatchewan finance minister was wearing a red dress
Lady in
today.
Red.
Lady
Yes.
in red for a budget that is bleeding red. Biggest deficit ever.
And I want to be clear, she looked smashing, as she always does, but she did wisely choose a red dress. Just to clarify, so people can grasp this, and I think you made a good point. The difference between last year and this year is that we were hit as a province, and understand that the budget was supposed to come down in May, in March, I apologize. We didn't actually see the actual revenue projections until June, but that was the problem because they were in no man's land understanding how a pandemic was going to hammer their revenue. And at that time, when they were presenting the initial budget, they basically locked down for a month and a half, almost 2 months. And then we've gone through the recovery process. This time, while they're not calling it a recovery budget, Arthur, I think the issue, as you're sort of outlining, is the fact that they are spending like they're trying to stimulate recovery, and that tends to be the issue. Where is that most evident in terms of them basically saying we're spending here to get things going again?
Well, I think that a lot of it, again, is coming out of their election promises. So we're seeing spending for a lot of just sort of hodgepodge programs that they announced during the campaign, like for support for insulin pumps, for reducing the cost of ambulances, but also a lot of lost revenue in terms of those, for the reduced tax rates for small business, for that rebate that they're giving for SAS Power customers. All of that comes out of the revenue side. Some of the expense increases are actually somewhat surprising. Like we're seeing an increase to the health budget that is only partially accounted for by the COVID-19 pressures. They're contributing $90 million to COVID-19 pressures to buy things like PPE, to bring forward their vaccination plan. But they found sort of an interesting way of calling a lot of their increased spending COVID-19 response. So we have $1.5 billion in COVID-19 response, but a lot of this isn't actually for the health sector. It's their election promises. So we have things like even the accelerated well site closure program that was funded by the federal government. Somehow that's put under the heading of COVID-19 response. Also, this SGI rebate that they decided just a few months ago to outdo the NDP on, that's also under COVID-19 response. One wonders why, but it's there.
Well, nothing beats
making
COVID
it seem
like
as though they're
yeah.
spending $1.5 billion to fight COVID by putting an SGI check back into your pocket.
Absolutely. Nothing beats COVID like driving more and cleaning up old wells. Phil, I'm an old guy. My memory sometimes isn't what it used to be, sometimes slips a bit, but I seem to recall during a provincial election, 6 months ago in October, certain political party being rather critical of a certain other political party for spending like mad, for basically not providing any kind of balanced budget plan for the next 4 years, and saying in essence that, hey, we're the SAS party, we're the government of, or we're the party of fiscal responsibility, and you guys are the party of crazy spenders. Am I wrong about that? I just want to be clear about that. And secondly, what do you see in this budget that makes that to be, or that makes you kind of sit back and say, what? Did I just read that right?
Yeah, well, you remember correctly. I think it's fair to say that a lot of people did not look at the NDP because they were scared of the debt in their and the deficit spending in their platform. And I believe the SAS party said something like, they have a plan to come up with a plan, but that's not a plan. And so it's interesting that their plan has been thrown out the window and it's been extended, and they'll have to face the voters before they balance the budget. According to what they put out today, and I agree with Arthur that they herald $1.5 billion in pandemic spending. I think about 600 million of that is like tax credits and rebates. And fair enough, I suppose you can suggest that is designed to stimulate the economy, but they're actually spending far less on health and safety. I think about a fifth of that of what they spent last year. In the pandemic response.
Yeah,
so
right.
if you actually look at the numbers closely, that's pretty interesting.
I'm fascinated when we'll actually see solutions to this imbalance that's growing, because right now we're looking at a $4 billion increase from the numbers I saw today in terms of public debt this year, close to that in the following year. So it's not increasing by any small margin. Public debt is going up by leaps and bounds, and in essence, basically at the end of the next budget cycle, every man, woman, and child in Saskatchewan is going to wind up owing $30,000. Is that something that we've just, as a voting public, have completely just lost track of, or is it because people are so focused on the idea that we need to get through this pandemic and we need to basically do things to re-stimulate the economy that they're willing to overlook that? I guess I'll start with you, Phil, and I'll get Arthur to add to this if he can.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that. I think it's questionable how much people will be even paying attention today. There's people lining up to get vaccines at the drive-throughs at various locations throughout the province. You have variants rising. I wonder whether this budget is not going to get the attention it deserves. This feels like the sort of budget you see pre-election, right? It doesn't seem like the first budget in a new regime's first year, because usually that's a tough budget, right? Usually they want to make all their tough decisions in their first year, lay out their platform, and then come up in 4 years with goodies and stuff like that. It feels like we're in a trajectory to go in the opposite direction, right? Because of course they're going to be reducing. They want to reduce the deficit to below $1 billion in 4 years. So it does feel that this is kind of a very odd budget, because of course we don't know the variants. Of course, nobody expected a third wave or a second wave, and however many waves you want to count it. I don't think anyone, in January said, well, these variants are really going to spike cases, and that's exactly what's happened. So, we don't know whether. We certainly hope it's not going to be as bad as last year, but every time you look at the numbers and see the variants, even worldwide, cases are rising again and deaths are rising again. So, we're entering into an area where we don't know. So, making any budget, is really difficult.
I'm going to get you the responses from two perspectives, one of which of sort of whether the choices made from what you've seen aren't necessarily wise, but if you could explain why they might be perceived as wise in terms of where they're going. But first, can you respond to how the NDP are reacting to that? Because I sensed a certain level of frustration from NDP leader Ryan Miley. Well, pardon me for saying this, because you probably have never heard me swear before, but Ryan Miley basically said he was pissed off at what he saw today in the budget. Well, does he have reason to be pissed off, and does he have reason to feel like he's had an end around done to him, basically by the Sask Party picking up a lot of and doing a lot of the things that they were very critical of him during the election campaign in October?
Well, he certainly said he was pissed off, but I'm not sure exactly for the reason that you're explaining. I mean, it is undoubtedly true that there is a certain degree of hypocrisy in what the Sask Party did during the election, where they pilloried him for being fiscally irresponsible and then run pretty much the same deficit that they were faulting him for promising to run. That being said, it seems as though Ryan Miley still wants to draw a pretty wide gap between the priorities that the government is following in this budget, even if it is a relatively high spending budget, and those that a theoretical NDP government would be following.
But did those narrow a bit today, though, in your mind? Like, because you and I've had this conversation, and I realized that it doesn't quite mirror everything the NDP did, but I don't know where the NDP has a huge lot of room to criticize them, because they are spending significant amounts on the pandemic, as Phil noted. They are spending on issues. Sometimes, as you said earlier, they seem to be padding that pandemic spending, but they are spending, and they are spending on economic stimulus, which seemed to me a huge part of the NDP October platform anyway, in terms of how to get Saskatchewan jobs going again, and a reoccurring theme. If you're the opposition right now in Saskatchewan, and you're facing a budget like this in which people don't seem to be terribly alarmed at big deficits and big spending and big debt, where do you go? Where is there room for Ryan Miley to criticize the government at this particular point?
Well, he can continue to criticize the government as long as he refuses to say how much his theoretical platform would cost. I mean, we asked him that during the press conference today, and he wouldn't say if the NDP commitments would drive the deficit up to $3 billion or $4 billion. He wouldn't round to the largest billion. So it's easy to criticize when you don't have to actually balance the budget. Of course, the Sask Party isn't doing that either. So we're all just kind of talking out of the air, I suppose. But the NDP and the Sask Party, even though that both of their platforms involve quite a bit of spending, I think have a very different sense of how to promote economic recovery. So the Sask Party is talking about things like opening more trade offices, partnering with universities to promote their export-focused growth plan. A lot of things like this small business tax reduction, obviously, whereas the NDP's is very different. It involves things like a $15 an hour minimum wage. It involves a lot more funding for long-term care and childcare. These are things that the Sask Party either didn't do or only made a very soft dent in this particular budget. So there's still, like, even if the top line numbers in terms of deficit spending in this budget look a lot like the NDP platform, I think that the nitty-gritty priorities are still quite a bit different.
Do you agree, Phil? Because we're dealing with a situation where line spending is up reasonably significantly. Capital spending with this government is about what it always has been. They've established a line of around $3.1 billion annually that they spend on capital projects, and they're still building schools and building hospitals and building like they have in essence for 13 previous years and as government. Two questions, I guess. Well, actually, just really one, if you get right down to it. Has this made criticism of this Sask party government somewhat difficult, or almost made them almost impenetrable to criticism by, in essence, doing things, at least in a broad way, the same as the NDP had proposed? And Arthur is right. There are significant differences in platform in essence, but I don't buy in the notion, given some of the line spending increases that I've saw today, that the NDP are going to have a huge amount of room to basically say, well, we would have spent more here, there, or everywhere. Where is there room for the NDP to make inroads or headway in this because of this budget and because of the spending choices of government?
Well, yeah, it's difficult. You can only spend so much time stamping your feet and saying you stole our ideas, and you're running up deficits. At a time when when interest rates are low, people aren't as concerned about it or aren't paying attention. I don't know that the NDP is going to get a lot of traction criticizing this budget. I guess that remains to be seen. I think people I think are focused on the pandemic and the vaccinations and things like that. So this may not get the attention it probably deserves. And it's kind of you mentioned capital spending. That's kind of a place where you might have thought it would increase over normal, because that's kind of the stimulus sort of thing that people think, oh, okay, if we're building bridges and roads and stuff like that. You look at the Biden administration in the States, well, they're definitely saying our economic recovery from this pandemic is going to be, infrastructure related. And of course, they have a wide definition of infrastructure. So it's kind of interesting that doesn't appear to be increasing that much over normal, because that's the sort of thing that even last year the Sask party was saying, right? We're going to give money to municipalities to build this and build that, and that'll help, our recovery. So that is an interesting category of this budget.
Arthur, can you carry on with that? Because I think you started and we went off in a different direction, but is there room for the NDP to criticize the Sask party for not doing enough in COVID? And it gets, I think, a little bit to what you were talking about before, about how much of the COVID spending is actually padding from other things and not going directly to healthcare, to issues like social services, to addictions. And they did, and by the way, they did, if you can talk about what they're spending on, particular areas that are related to COVID but are long-standing or added difficulties like addiction treatment and others. They did address that. But I guess, given people's concerns out there, is there concern, notwithstanding that we have this record spending and record deficits, that they just didn't do enough when it comes to things related to the problem of the day, which obviously is COVID-19 still?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think that there still is a lot of room for criticism. I'm not saying that it's necessarily going to be effective, but there is room for criticism if the NDP does it right. And we heard some of that today. They're going to continue to criticize the Sask party government for not being there to support people during the pandemic, for not spending enough, for not doing the circuit breaker when in their view it should have been done. And I think that the fact that most of the government's quote unquote pandemic spending is on things that are only tangentially related to the pandemic still leaves a certain opening for the NDP to continue to make those arguments. Now, and I just want to follow up on what you talked about debt and deficit. I'm also inclined to think that people don't care a great deal about that at this present moment. Virtually every government is running substantial deficits and is racking up debt. and the province here is in a much better fiscal situation than most. The argument that the government repeatedly makes that they have a very low debt to GDP, a very low debt to a GDP ratio is totally valid. It's one of the lowest in the country. We're not paying a lot in terms of interest, and that's still a relatively low portion of total expense. So there's still a pretty big margin of maneuver so long as interest rates stay low.
I disagree because I think people just generally don't understand it. We're paying $755 million a year because of interest, which is the second highest total ever. It's going to be the sixth biggest line item, and that gets paid first before we can spend anything on schools, on roads, on highways, and everything, which is problematic. But you're right, people don't pay any attention to it because of, in essence, the times that we're in. But on budget day, you kind of wish that people would pay attention to look how much we are actually spending, and somebody down the road is going to have to pay for it. Which brings me to the other problem, and maybe we'll get Phil to talk about this before we just end off. I don't know if the economic structure in Saskatchewan is as strong as we used to, because one thing that I found interesting is they're still contemplating roughly the same oil price for the next 4 years. Even in the worst days, everybody was optimistic that oil would be going up another $10 a barrel or wherever. But that's our fundamental problem, or that's the fundamental basis for added growth. We got really lucky. It was a really good year in agriculture last year. Didn't have to pay up much in crop insurance, and there was kind of a big yield, although that doesn't really translate into necessarily immediate revenue until the next year's income tax. But fundamentally, right now in Saskatchewan, do you see a problem, Phil? And I look at it because right now the government, the finance minister added on that, well, we had to add a little bit extra in the budget this year that we weren't anticipating after we closed the file, because we moved to further restrictions in Regina to close restaurants and do things and have to basically provide some support to people in that city. I'm thinking the way the numbers are going in other places, the Southeast and Moose Jaw, and maybe now into Saskatoon, the COVID numbers are such where this might not be the only place where we're going to have a little bit of a problem. Is there going to be a structural problem for the government to handle in the out years following today's budget that they really aren't addressing, that you see, Phil?
Yeah, I think you make a really good point there, and I think the opportunity for the NDP and frankly other parties too, even like the Buffalo Party on the right and other opposition parties, lies in the years ahead. It might not be this year when people will say, okay, we don't care about deficits and debt right now because we're in the middle of a pandemic. But once we're hopefully past that, then I think people will start to see the debt and the deficit and ask questions like the ones you're asking, like how sound is our economy? Where are oil prices going? It's interesting how much the Sask Party government now and Sask Power now talks about renewable energy. The NDP had a news conference in Saskatoon on last week, to talk about the need to move to renewable energy. So obviously, at least they think that's a winning strategy. I'm not sure it is at this stage. That is going to get a lot of traction right now. But
we know the government doesn't like electric cars much. That's for sure.
Well, people have short memories, and people will remember the pandemic for the rest of their life. But when their, taxes get cut, or taxes go up, or the government has to take other measures to balance the budget. Those are tough measures. Like even their 2026, 27 estimate is it's going to require some tough decisions down the road. So that's where I think the real opportunity to criticize this government is going to come.
I wish we could talk about this more because there's so much to cover, but please read our coverage in the Leader Post and the Star Phoenix, because we go into further detail on some of these very things. Thanks for tuning in. Thank you, Arthur. Thank you, Phil, for your work today. And it'll be a long day yet, but we'll get through another budget day. Take care.